getting our keyframes timed out the way we want them to be, positioned correctly, the values are correct so we're not intersecting. The next part of it becomes more of a finessing thing of, you know what, I want it to go a little bit quicker here, a little bit slower here. Without adjusting the keyframes, we can still do that, okay? So like on this guy, if I go to my graph editor, you can see the graphs that are in here. These are not the default graphs that came with it. Once I started playing with them, I was able to get them into this shape, okay? And what that allows me to do is, again, just give another level of refinement, a little bit more detail to these things. Now, by default, if I go into any one of these keys, let me go to this guy because I don't think he has any on him. Nope, he does all of them. There you go, something like this. So by default, I can just rotate these like this. By rotating this handlebar, it does the same thing that kind of Illustrator, Photoshop, all of those do with the pen tool, where it manipulates that curve. On this guy, you can see how tight the peaks are. I still have that slow in, slow out, but that whole process of where that slowness comes in is shortened, okay? And the way I do that is the same kind of way, is that I'm now using the handlebars, and you can see how I can stretch out or condense, or shrink or condense that thing, whatever word that would be. Okay, so I can really play with this and really kind of set this thing up. This is the base's movement. So right at the beginning, this base, I wanted to have a much more drastic, like slow, 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 and then it speeds up and starts going quick. So I created this graph here, which goes pretty slow and then picks up speed. The default was this. Oops. Well, if I did that, there's flat. So you can see it's very quick. Okay, it just starts going very quick. And then by doing that, it goes slower, and then it starts picking up speed, starts going much quicker after this point. Okay, and it gives it a little bit more whiplash than the other one does. Okay, here's the default one. I mean, it's a subtle thing, and a lot of these you kind of have to watch like 100 times before you can see the difference. But you can kind of see it there a little bit. Okay, especially if I go to all of these and just do that default flat, you can see how boring this thing is going to be. Okay, and let me make sure that my playback speed is set to real time. There you go. You can see there's definitely like a stop there, like it stops for too long at each interval, and I didn't like that. So what I did is I took each of these and I just condensed them, except for that first one, so they were all tighter. So it still slowed down at the end, but it slowed down for a lot less time. Oops. Okay, now the way we're able to do that is I'm going to just grab a cube, sure. Create polygon, active off. Alright, I'm just going to set a key here. Go up over here and set a key. Wonderful. Okay. So this is the default stuff that we get, is just these handlebars can be adjusted like this. They can be adjusted like that, but not pulled out. Okay, you can see I'm pulling, nothing's happening. So what I need to do is I need to go to curves and make them weighted tangents. So make sure you write that down, curves weighted tangents. And that's a per graph item, okay? So for translate Y, I have to do it, translate X, I would have to do it, and translate Z, I would have to do it to make them weighted. Okay, so select the graph, curves, weighted tangents. You'll see that when I do make it weighted tangents, that these bars become a lot bigger. Okay, that's step one. It's still not doing anything. You'll see it's still the same exact thing. So what I have to do is, these have tangent weights, but now I have to free the tangent weights. I don't know why it's a two-step thing. I've never used this weighted tangents without going to the other one. Someone might use it, but I don't. So the next step is, once we do that, then we go under tangents and we say free tangent weight. Okay? With free tangent weight, that opens up these little holes. The handlebar now has an opening at it, and then I can grab that handlebar, and then I can start to tweak it. Okay? So I can really take this and manipulate it. Now this one doesn't have the holes open. So the first one, the weighted tangents, I can grab a whole curve and make the entire thing weighted. But then the free tangent weight, I have to go to every point that I want and make those free tangent weights. Okay? So I would go grab this, go to tangents, free the tangent weight, and now I can manipulate this one the same way. Okay? So now this kind of graph here, if you look at that, we're going to have very little movement, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's going to skyrocket. Okay? So let's watch in the Translate Y and see this thing go crazy. See how slow it's moving, and then at the last second, it just kind of jumps up. Okay? Let me make it a little bit more drastic by taking this up higher. And I'll really exaggerate this. There we go. So there we go. No movement, no movement, no movement. Then once we get to the last quarter of it, you can see it jumps quite a bit. Okay, so that's one thing, adding to your graph, just kind of tweaking those and sharpening up some of those hills and valleys just to make it a little bit more, you know, this thing is going to that side. It has to have enough speed so that when it hits, it looks like it should be flopping over. And it's not just like going here and then this like flops over, and then going here and then that flops over. Okay, look at the speed that the whole thing is moving and make sure that it makes sense as to how much movement we're getting on that arm. Does that make sense? Okay. The next part of it is this. I'm going to delete that. Are these things rotating? I didn't want these to be flat ever. Okay. I wanted these arms to be nice and fluid and moving the entire time. So if I take all of these and I make them all flat, what's going to happen here is that from this point to that point, it changes. Okay. So from here to there, obviously it changes. From here to here, it changes. But in this area, there's a little bit of a step, but it's basically saying the same thing. Okay? So what happens is this thing goes back like this, and it goes perfectly straight. And then when it gets to that side, it flops over. And then it goes perfectly straight, and then it flops over. We don't want that. We want it to look like it has some kind of bounce to it. So that's why I went into these. And maybe I used one of these. I don't remember. But a lot of times I just play with it. And I say, okay, what do I want this to do? I want this to have a little bit more motion coming here. And now what this is going to do is it's going to come down, and it's going to kind of bounce, or gradually come down. When it gets to the side, it flips over, and then it gradually comes up, and then it flips back over. Okay, so it's constantly flowing back and forth, and it does that for every single one of those. Okay, so there's just two things that are really going to add to this. Okay, now we don't do those all at once. We go through and do the first stage of tweaking those hills and valleys on the base of it, then going through and then manipulating this kind of stuff. Okay, and the process we've done this in, where we kind of set keys on the bottom, then set keys for each one, work out the timing, work out the values, then come back and start tweaking the graph. That's how you want to approach it. Okay, now here's the reason why we do that in that order, and it'll get you when we get to the ball on ramp. Let's pretend that we have this thing perfect. Wonderful. And then I say, you know what? I think this is just a little bit too much speed. Let's say here I want to condense it. I'm going to stretch it out somewhere else. So then I go to my dope sheet, and then I just start grabbing some keyframes and just scooting some stuff over like that. Okay. And then when I go back to my graph editor, I should have taken a snapshot before, but typically what's going to happen is this is now going to change. Because I push stuff together, sometimes what will happen, and it wasn't drastic enough here, is that this thing here would actually be like that. Because I push those graphs too close together, and the only way to keep it smooth for Maya is to do that funky thing. Okay? So you don't want to be editing time at this stage. We've edited the time first, then we edited the values. Now we're going to go back and tweak the actual movement between all of these keys. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So that's the animation part. It's pretty simple if you just take those steps and just look at each one of it. And again, make sure that that movement, I reopen this so we look at the actual movement of it. The movement of it is like this, where we can see it flopping to the side, and we don't have that middle movement where it's constantly going like this. That bar, if you look at it, is always pointing towards the edge, towards the edge, towards the edge. Okay? Some of them it's like towards the middle as this thing goes. Okay, I'm going to come around today and look at these also, so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Now for the background, let me switch my camera. In this instance, what I've done is I've used an HDR, and I'm lighting it with an HDR. You don't have to do that. Okay? I can delete that also. I'm going to delete my light also. I'll even grab this whole thing and I'll assign Lambert 1 to it. There we go. So everything's back to default. So this is the best way to set up anything that we're doing, where we just have kind of like an item that we want to light and have it look good. As we do, just lost the word. It's like a photo shoot. If anyone thinks of the word, let me know. Photo shoot product. Screen. I need screen. There we go. Cove. There we go. Not that it's in there. But you can see how this backdrop here, there's no edge right there. There's an edge here, obviously, but there's no edge back here. And that's what we want to do. We want to have a nice coved or rounded background so that we don't see an edge. So it looks nicer, it looks cleaner. And the only sharpness that we're getting is from our object. And if you look at product shot. If you look at a lot of these product shots, some of them do have it. This Harry Potter book, I think it's very, very subtle, but it's there. This one, a little bit more drastic, has it. That has it. This one doesn't have it. These don't. That one does. Okay, but they look nicer not having that line there. So I'd take a plane, a regular plane, figure out which direction we're going, so it's going that way. And then I take the back of it, and I just extrude, oops, edit mesh, extrude edge, and I just extruded that edge. Okay, I could have also taken a cube and deleted the other faces of the cube except for that. That's perfectly acceptable. I'm going to stretch this out. I'm going to grab that new edge right here, and I'm going to go to edit mesh again, and I'm going to say bevel. And I'm just going to put in enough divisions here and take this down to be small enough that I have a nice little edge right there. So now you see from here, we don't really have that edge, that hard edge in there. So it looks nicer already. I'm going to add an area light. Area lights look nicer. I had a guy last year use a spotlight, and it was more like this is a stage, and this thing's on here, and the spotlight actually like clicked on, and then it kind of followed him, so it was like part of the story. But if you're just doing overall lighting, area lights work great. Let me just set it down here, pull it up there. Okay. I'm using a linear workflow for this. If you're familiar with linear workflow, I'm turning it off for this demonstration because you don't need to have that. Linear workflow makes things look nicer. Definitely should use it. If you wanted to create some portfolio pieces and really kind of push it, but we don't need it. Okay, so my light, it is not doing anything. Area light's on, 1. I'm using mental ray. We want to use mental ray for all of these. I'm going to turn off my final gather. We don't need that. I'm going to turn my sampling down. DXR. I'll turn my light up just to see. All right, give me a second. It's always something. I was too close apparently. Let's go back here. I don't know what it was. It was just Maya being stupid. Alright, set that back to 1. You know what it might have been? I wonder if I was in my, yep. It was running my perspective view, which was from the other side. All right, so there we have. You can see just by a default light, I'm going to brighten it up just so you can see it better on the screen. Just by having a default light in there, a nice cove rounded background, this is already pretty nice. Remember, one of our 12 principles of animation is attractiveness and solid lines. So we don't want to have this thing be too murky that we can't see what's going on. So it's very important that we can see the detail in here. All right. So I'm even going to push this back just a tiny bit, like that. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is give this stuff some coloring. Now, if I click on, remember that the objects here are on their own layer. Okay. So I can't actually grab those objects. So I'm going to turn the R off so I can grab the objects. But if I give a texture to any one of these objects down here, it assigns it to everything above it. Okay? So if I grab this bottom piece and I assign a new material, and I'm recommending you use Mia X passes for all of these. And just for this demo, I'm just going to color this horrible colors just like blue. There we go. All right, so that's blue. So you see that it assigned blue to everything. So what I would do is if I want these cylinders to be blue and the rods to be yellow, let's say, then I would go, this is my cylinder. So I would call this one cylinder material. I would click on the rod and I would go to assign new material, assign a new Mia for that. Call this rod material. We'll give this a yellowy orangey color like that. And then I would go to the next cylinder and I would just go to my lighting and shading and assign the cylinder. Thank you. I was looking at my old materials, it confused me. Then I would go to the next rod and I would go to assign the bar material. Oops, not the bar material. Rod material, there we go. And I would go to the next cylinder. And I have to do it in that order. And I could even use recent commands, but I'm just going to stick to this. And yeah, it's going to take you 5 seconds to do, but do it. And there we go. Okay, so it didn't take terribly too long. The ground, I'm going to assign a material to it. And another Mia, make it a light color. I don't want reflection on this. Okay. Obviously I could adjust some of the coloring in here. I don't really like that color, but I can play with that another time. Okay, so now that I have this, it's pretty easy to see that there's good contrast between the background and the foreground items. That's good. I can adjust my lighting here if I need to. Maybe I don't want it head on. Maybe I want to have it, off to the side. Keep an eye on how big your shadows are because that can kind of, ruin your scene. If you have this really tiny area lights mean that it's going to have a tinier shadow. You can see how sharp that shadow is now. And what that means is that now we're going to see the shadow moving across, and that could kind of ruin and take away from what we're doing. Okay, so you got to be careful with that. So just find that happy ground where you can still see shadow, you can still see that's making contact, but it's not like bouncing out at you. There you go. Something like that is actually pretty good. Okay, so let's pretend that that's fine. Lighting is fine. The texturing is fine. We can tweak those further if we need to. There we go. In our render settings, we're going to render out 2 different files for every single one of these initial ones. These first 3 assignments that we do, we're rendering out one that has no motion blur and one that has motion blur. So every movie that we make for the first 3 is going to be 2 movies. One for motion blur, one for no motion blur. So in the common tab, I'm going to call this stick_no-mo for no motion blur. I'll just leave it as an if. That's fine. I can render it as an if. Name.number.extension. I put in how many frames I have here. I picked my camera that I'm rendering from. Your camera should not be anything crazy. We'll get further in on cameras. For the stick animation, typically just leave it in a good spot. Find a good angle where you can see that whole motion going on. Okay, don't let it go out of frame. Just make sure you get it in frame, but you're close enough that it looks nice. Quality, I'll make sure this is turned up to 2. I don't need any final gather. You can add it if you want. You don't have to. You're not going to get any extra points for just having final gather on. And that's it for the no motion blur one. So then we would just go to rendering and say render batch render. It would go through, do all of its stuff. Probably in a half hour with no motion blur, this thing would be done. Okay? Then we would go back and we would get rid of the no, and we would have one that says stick motion blur. And then we would go to the quality tab, and under motion blur, we would change this to no deformation. The difference between no deformation and full is that full means that you're going to be distorting vertices. Okay? If we had a human face, and the human face is like stretching and squashing and talking and doing all this stuff, and we want a motion blur on it, we would use full. Because we're simply taking a single object and moving it and rotating it, there's no vertice deformation. It's only object deforming. We want to make sure that these steps are pretty high. So put your steps up to like 15. You can lower it if you realize, hey, this is taking like an hour a frame. But you want to have a good number of, look at that, a good number of frames in there. There we go. I'll say this here. And I'll test this out and see. I want to look at it, and I want to see what that motion blur looks like. Sometimes it's going to be super grainy and super horrible. Here, it looks pretty good. We get a little bit of feathering right at the end. Not so much, not so much. A little bit more there. Okay? We should really get motion blur where things are moving. So if there's a lot of motion in these certain areas, that's where we should be seeing that motion blur. If this number is too low, what that means is it's not having enough in-betweens of that motion blur, and we're going to get jaggediness, or we're going to lose volume, or whatever. All right? You'll definitely see it in this. An example of that is we had in our bouncing ball. The ball comes down, it hits the ground, and comes back up. It's only like one frame that it's here, one frame it's here, one frame it's there. So when it starts blurring between these frames, it needs enough in between frames to create that blur to make it look realistic. Okay? So we typically crank that up. You can play with other settings, if you really, motion blur by 10. That's going to blur by 10 frames, so it's going to look probably weird. There you go. So obviously that's not correct motion blur, because now it just ruined our animation. Okay? So some of these you can play with if you realize, hey, I'm not getting enough motion blur. You can come down to this and start playing with that. All right. So that should be good. And then we would render that out as well. Okay? So you render one with no motion blur, one with motion blur. And then just to complete the process, I'm just going to show you in After Effects how we just put that movie together. Same process that we've done before, just bringing in the sequence, making it into a movie, and you're done. But just so it's all in the video so you can reference it. That. All right, so I'm going to double click in the project area. I'm going to go find my video. It actually doesn't matter what video I grab. I'll make sure I grab the right one. Stick. Oops. Right stick one, which was right here. Image sequence, import. Wonderful. I'm going to drag this down to the new comp button. And here is my animation. Okay, now this isn't the moving one, this is just the one with motion blur doing that. Okay, so again, you want to assess it, you want to look at it and make sure that it's looking appropriate for what you're trying to show off. Looks good. And then we'll go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. We click on Lossless, change our format to QuickTime, change our format options. H264, wonderful. After Effects CC 2014, I think CC is the same. Audio output is automatic, so if it has audio, it outputs it. If it doesn't, then it won't. So you can just leave that alone. Make sure you label these with your name and put it into your folder. So Sarcona, bar animation, stick animation, whatever, motion blur. Or if it's no motion blur, no motion blur. Okay, that way I know whose it is and I know what the assignment is. Then we hit render, voila, After Effects is done, wonderful. You turn that one in. Then you're going to turn the other one in too, making the movie the same way for the non-motion blur one. Okay? And then you're going to drop it into 2540, turn in, oops, stick animation. Okay, so inside the stick animation folder in the turn in folder, you're just going to drop your 2 movies in there. So when all of these are due, they're not going to be due for a couple weeks, you're going to drop 2 movies for the stick animation, 2 movies for the bouncing ball, and then 2 movies for the ball on track. Okay? Once we're done with these first 3 assignments where we're doing animating, then we're not going to be doing double renders. This is the only part we're doing double renders, just so you can see the process of no motion blur and motion blur. Motion blur makes things look 10 times better, but it's very costly when you start rendering your stuff. Okay? Any questions on the graph editor, the rendering it out? Okay, as long as your stuff looks pretty, I'm not going to be concerned of how you get it out pretty. You know, if you used blends and fongs and some nice lights, that's fine. If you use Lamberts and whatever else, that's fine. If you use some of the things you can't use, like you couldn't use the toon shader on this and get motion blur, I don't think that would work. It's possible. Just for fun, you can go to this, and you'll see that we get this toon shader. So then we render it. I guess that does work. Right? So you could also do like a toon shader thing. Let's just add an outline to this. Add an outline. Nope, we can't. We don't get the outline. If I swap that to Maya Software, there we go. So in Maya Software, we would get the outline, but in Mental Ray, we don't. Okay, but you can play around with some things and see. I'm looking at the animation, but I'm also looking at to make sure that we have, you know, the solid line, so I can see what's happening. It's not murky. You don't have this background color being blue. There you go. It's this really dark blue that you really can't see. And then all of these are really dark colors too that you can't really see. I'll even make it a dark yellow. Okay, it should be able to see these things. There. Something like that is just, you can't even see it on the projector. The bottom piece you can kind of see. There you go. If I brighten it up, you can, but then I ruin it because now you can't see anything. Okay? So make sure you're picking good color combinations that go together. All right? Make sure you have some good contrast. The background being lighter, the foreground being, darker colors typically helps. There we go. Okay. Complementary colors, you can use resources like Adobe Cooler, Kuler. This is a good way to kind of pick out different color schemes. Because basically you pick one color. Like I like this. Oops, this is my main color. I like this color blue. And you pick out that color blue, and it gives you colors that match that color blue. So it'll kind of help get you in the right area. You can also pick monochromatic or triad or complementary colors. Okay, things that work good with each other. All right, so don't be afraid to use resources like that as well. All right, make sure you're saving your work. Make sure you're using your preferences. Make sure you're backing up your work. You want to try to get these rendered out by the end of the week. Okay. Next class, I'm going to introduce the bouncing ball, just because I think at that point you guys are going to be ready to start rendering these, and I want you to have something to do while you're rendering the one assignment. You're working on the bouncing ball. Okay? Any questions?
Can we see an example of one that's good and one that's bad?
Yes.